Good afternoon and welcome to our event for I am Dr. Jeffrey Burns. I'm the director of the Center for Catholic Thought and Culture here at the University of San Diego. And I'm happy to welcome you to our Urgent Challenges series. And today we are very blessed to have Dr. Charles Clark, a senior fellow at the Vincentian Center for Church and Society at St. John's University, where he is also a professor of economics. He also serves as an advisor to the Holy See Permanent Mission to the United Nations. He's published all sorts of articles and books, including Economic Theory and Natural Philosophy, Pathways to a Basic Income Guarantee, Ensuring Progress and Prosperity in the 21st Century, and many, many other edited works. So he is a very distinguished scholar, and we're happy to welcome Dr. Clark to the University of San Diego today.
Thank you very much. First, every time I have an introduction which mentions my working at the UN, I have to point out nothing I say represents the official position of the Pope at the United Nations. I'm an advisor. I deal with a lot of economic issues. I cover the Statistical Commission, which is probably one of the least controversial parts at the UN. But I once gave a speech on the UN on Catholic social thought and basic income, and a journalist wrote a paper, Vatican advisor says basic income needs to be considered. Our Vatican expert says basic income needs to be considered. And first, I don't think there is a Vatican expert. I mean, nobody knows what's going on there. But second of all, the Vatican doesn't take positions on domestic policy for different countries. But in any case, I'm very glad to be here. And for all the economic students who are here, yes, demand can go down by less than 10 billion if demand curve goes down by 10 billion, or someone asked me a question, but we do it with magic. That's economics. Okay, so I've been asked to talk about wealth inequality. Okay, first I'm going to talk a little bit about the general problem of inequality, which 20, 30 years ago was not discussed much by academic economists, or it wasn't part of the political debate. But certainly after the financial crisis, 2008, 2009 became a very hot topic, particularly with Bernie Sanders in the Bernie Sanders campaign. Then I'm going to talk about wealth inequality, which is different than the income inequality that we're usually talking about. We'll look at some trends, look at how Catholic social thought views on wealth have helped to inform, at least a bit, how we look at wealth, or at least how the international institutions do. And then some recent moves towards an inclusive economy. At least I am hopeful. Okay, I'm going to start out with two propositions, which again, I did say them 30 years ago, and they would be in the minority, but now there's a general consensus. The first is that wealth and income inequality is excessive in the advanced capitalist economies, particularly in the United States, England, Canada, and many other countries. And that this is harmful to the economy. Economies grow slower because of this. Economies are less stable because of this. The financial crisis was partly blamed because of inequality. And the official report of the United Nations, income inequality was the first reason given for the cause of the financial crisis. And that it's harmful for society, that it makes societies sick. It makes the politics caustic, it's bad for the environment, it hurts trust, all sorts of things that are harmful are being tied by economists and other social sciences to rise in inequality. The second is that there is a decoupling in wealth and economic growth and well-being. That is, economies that are getting richer are not producing happier people, they're not improving the well-being of their communities. And this is, again, that is what is the inequality, but fairly, it is growing very quickly, particularly in official institutions that if you want to improve the well-being of the population, just increasing economic growth is not going to do it. In fact, that the many ways you can increase economic growth, well, you will make people worse off. As I said, these were radical positions 30 years ago, but now the IMF, the World Bank, the Federal Reserve, many governments, and many of the top economists, often after they win a Nobel Prize, so they can now say things and not worry that they might not win the Nobel Prize. I once had lunch with Joseph Stiglitz and teased him on how he's become much more reasonable since he won the Nobel Prize than he did before. And these are also both positions that the Catholic Church, both in its teachings and Catholic social thought, but also at the UN, has been pushing since the mid-60s. Since Pope Paul VI, Popular Progresso, came out, they did a very big public relations campaign and presentation. And in UN histories of the Millennium Development Goals, they start with two events, and that's one of them, as having the impact of changing how we think about development. Okay, so just to look at the general problem, why inequality is a problem politically. And here we have two graphs, which I really think help to explain why there is so much anger in the United States, why there are so many people, tens of millions, who felt like they've been left behind because they have been left behind, and feel like that the economy is not working for them. If we look at the one on your, on my right, so I guess that's your left, the blue line is the increase in income for households in the 90th percentile. So 90% of Americans, this is their growth. And we see that starting after World War II, I think the first year is 1949, up until the 1970s, people at the bottom, this isn't even the bottom, but the 90 percentile, their incomes are growing faster than the top 10%. In fact, the bottom 20% grow faster than the next 20%. If you look at the whole period as one period, the next 20% grew faster than the 60th percent. The 60th grew faster than the 80th, and the 80th grew faster than the top 20. So this is when the middle class majority economy and society of America was created. This is what a lot of people say, making America great again. This is particularly true if you're a white male who had all the benefits of this. If you were Black, Hispanic, or female, you were not experiencing all the benefits. This is when American workers didn't have to compete with workers against the rest of the world because they were either in colonies or just so low in their development that they weren't competing for us in jobs in our manufacturing, et cetera. It's before globalization. So this is when the US economy grew better than at any other time in history. After the 1970s, we see the top 10% growing rapidly and a stagnation for the other groups. In fact, in the other graph, where we look at productivity growth and real median family income, again, we see real median family income right on top of productivity growth. So productivity growth is the growth in the economy. So the economy is growing and everybody, at least the average family, is sharing that. And that's what you want. That means their incomes are going up and they're benefiting from them being more productive. An increase in productivity means workers are producing more per hour. But after the late 70s, we see real median family income stagnant, going up and down, but no real progress. Yet the economy keeps on producing, not at a higher rate, but slightly lower rate, but it's still increasing. The economy is growing, all the benefits are going to the top. Okay, but today we're going to look at something that's a little different, and that's wealth inequality. Now, economists, even though economics is known as the science of wealth, we do not have a settled definition of what is wealth. There's a lot of things we don't have a settled definition of. But when we look at wealth inequality, we usually mean households' ownership of their housing, stocks and bonds, their savings accounts, any land, or any assets they have Basically, wealth represents our productive assets, and income is used to buy consumption. And the idea, this goes back to Adam Smith, is society grows by taking part of its overall production, setting it aside either through savings or other means to be invested so we can produce more in the future. And what we pay out in incomes, that then gets used to consume so people can feed themselves and pay their bills today. The graph here, we just have a comparison of wealth and income inequality. We see the blue, which is income, is more equal, and that is at the lower levels, it's much higher than the wealth. The wealth, the orange, different shades of orange, the top 20% have nearly 90% of all wealth in the United States. The top 1% have 30% of all wealth. On the right here, we see an even more extreme example of this. We have the orange bar is the wealth of the bottom 50%. That's basically 165 million Americans. Their total wealth is equal to 3 people in 2019. And I see that Elon Musk isn't on the list. He's a little latecomer to this. And then the other graph just shows you the trends. The most interesting is the share of the 90%, around a little over 30% in 1962, is consistently going down. So it's a transfer of wealth from everybody, the 90%, or as Occupy would say, the 99%, to the 1%. And a lot of that is matched by an increase in debt in the lower 99%, which debt rates have gone up. And there's, in many ways, a very close correlation to increasing wealth and increasing debt. If you increase the financial assets, you have to increase financial debt somewhere. Why is wealth important? Well, in the long run, our standard of living is based on how much productive assets we have invested in. And this is the basic economic model, at least from Adam Smith on, that we get wealth somehow, we invest that. The investment causes economic growth, which increases everyone's well-being. So this is the justification for increasing wealth, is that it will lead to economic growth for everyone. John Maynard Keynes, in the Economic Consequences of the Peace, the second chapter, where he gives like an economic history of Europe, he says that this is the bargain that workers struck with capitalists. Capitalists would get the lion's share of the increase in output, but they would not spend it on themselves. They would use it to industrialize the country. Workers' incomes would go up slowly, but eventually the benefits would be shared. And by the 20th century, Keynes is arguing, now is the time we have to start sharing the benefits. In fact, in the general theory, which explains the Great Depression, he says that the Great Depression is that the biggest problem is inequality in wealth and incomes. And that's the barrier to having full employment. So wealth is created in 2 different ways, basically. One is the old-fashioned way, and that is it's stolen. I call it wealth capture, and that is with the use of force and fraud. You conquer someone's land, you enslave some people, you monopolize markets, you create artificial scarcities, the prices go up and you earn a lot more. Or if you can shift the costs away from yourself onto others, you've increased your take in the economy, and you've made other people pay more for that. When Adam Smith was writing The Wealth of Nations in 1776, and really all I ever wanted to do was be an Adam Smith scholar, so everything basically gets back to Adam Smith. I apologize beforehand. But he's arguing against the mercantilists who argue that wealth is just getting more gold and silver, which you get through stealing silver from other countries, enslaving other people, stealing the land, and then stealing the silver from other countries. That's the basic model. And he's arguing, and you keep it at the top. You don't share it. Because if you pay the poor, there'll be less wealth. And the poor, we just did this in my poverty class. We looked at the mercantilist writings. If you pay the poor higher wages, it will all go to the pub. General consensus. They'll just drink, they won't work. And so we have to keep them hungry so that they're productive, so that the civilized people can have a civilized life. Smith argued, no, we can create more wealth by increasing the efficiency of workers. And this is through the division of labor, the development of machinery, the moving people from unproductive activities, such as, having 50 servants at your estate, to having them do productive things that produce goods that everyone will benefit from. So by investing in productive capital, improvements in technology, and improvement in managerial efficiency is one of the great stories of the 20th century, was just managing companies better leads to more efficient operations, greater output, which eventually leads to a very high standard of living, the ability to send people into outer space, to the moon, and what we call, the good life. Now, Smith presents an argument, and economists have followed this ever since, that when you have wealth creation under capitalism, markets direct where it's going to go. So markets will lead investment to where it has the highest return, and the highest return is based on what we as consumers like. What we are going to buy, the companies who do that will earn the highest rate of return. In fact, he only uses the phrase the invisible hand twice in the meaning that we attach to it, and once is in how it will direct investment, even though the capitalists aren't interested in improving the general well-being, they just want to get what's the highest return from themselves, but the market will push them towards that. And that's why he argues that we should have markets instead of governments directing how wealth is used. Again, he's arguing against mercantilism, where wealth will be used for your merchants, for your navy, so that you can go out and conquer more people and those sort of activities. But in practice, even in capitalist economies, a lot of wealth is created not just through technological change and improvements in managerial efficiency, et cetera, but through a mixture of wealth creation and wealth capture. A lot of wealth starts with inherited wealth, and that just means your ancestors stole it from somebody, and not that, I got it the honest way. I inherited the money. I didn't have to do anything dishonest, but someone did something dishonest somewhere along the line. And most big corporations, not most, every single big corporation that becomes a large wealthy institution does so outside of the competitive market model. They do not exist in perfect competition. That allows them to capture, economists sometimes we call these quasi-rents, but they get to capture more income than they would have if they had competitive conditions. Skip over that. And if we're to look at, we're going to look quickly at how wealth has changed. And I decided to pick who was the richest person at the time of the Revolution. Charles Carroll of Carrollton. My family comes from these Catholic Maryland early settlers. At the time, he was worth 2.1 million pounds, which today might only be about $100. I mean, because the pound is collapsing rapidly. And I try to not let my Irishness laugh at it too much, but I'm sure they're enjoying it in Dublin. But it's about $400 million last week. How was he so rich? His grandfather had been the land agent for Lord Baltimore, had took options on, I think, 40,000 acres and had purchased 10,000 acres. And then when the war ended, the British were kicked out, those options became permanent ownership. So George Washington said no one risked more on signing the Declaration of Independence than Charles Carroll. In fact, he gave his address, although they said that he did that so that his cousins wouldn't be killed. Because if you sign the Declaration of Independence, he's the only Catholic to sign the Declaration of Independence, you were signing your death sentence. If the British caught you, they were going to string you up. but he had been signing his name, Charles Carrollton, for a while. And so the big source of land, the big source of economic power back then was land and slaves. And so that's how he became the richest man at the time. Today, Elon Musk is, at least as of last week, considered the wealthiest man in America, if not on the planet. His wealth comes from he owns two companies that are valued very highly. Of course, that could drop. But basically, he and his companies are worth a lot because they own intellectual property. Same thing with Microsoft, with Google, Facebook. They own ideas and can control who uses them and who gets the benefit from them. They have physical plant, but it's pretty meaningless in terms of what the value of their company is. And for Facebook, their physical plant is completely meaningless. I mean, it's all intellectual capital. So today's economy, it's the ownership of ideas that is the source of real economic power. How much land you own is really irrelevant. And we see this transition, 1770, 3/5 of all wealth is either land, which we took from the Indians, or slaves. So clearly this is captured, wealth captured efficiently. And then you have housing is the light gray. And then the darker gray, that is domestic capital. Eventually that gets big once we start to industrialize factories and all the productive capabilities that grew to become, the powerhouse of our manufacturing economy. But certainly in the last 20 years, the manufacturing part, if we could divide it with intellectual property, would have been declining, and intellectual property would be the most important source of wealth now. Now, the idea is that when the economy is starting to develop, you want wealth inequality to increase. So here we have the Kuznets curve, it's a famous curve that economists use to explain lots of things. But at the beginning of the development process, inequality, whether wealth or income, is going to increase as the first groups of entrepreneurs are very successful. They're making lots of money, and most of the economy is still traditional self-sufficient farmers, so their income's going to be low. So you'll have the first wave of capitalists will do really well, they'll make a lot of money, but at some point, and you need them to have control over the productive assets because they'll invest it into more manufacturing, more plants, more factories, et cetera. And this is the story I told you that Keynes tells in the economic consequences of the peace. But at some point, the wealth inequality becomes a problem, that you need to have more purchasing power, less emphasis on more capital. And so now you have to start increasing the wages of workers so you have people who buy what you make. You move from a high investment economy to a consumption economy. This is what China has been trying to do. They had very high growth rates. It's very easy to have a generation and a half of 10% growth rates if you have a relatively efficient and not very corrupt government that could force everyone, we're going to go ahead with this. But at some point, you have all the roads, you have all the factories, you have all the dams, and you've exported as much as you can, you're going to need your own consumers to buy it. And so they're trying to manage that transition to a consumer economy. Everyone's gone through it, and it's the difficult transition for a lot of reasons, but I don't want to go into that. But if you look at the graph on the right, we have what many people thought was the downward part of the Kuznets curve. Income inequality here, this is the share of income of the top 1%. It's at 25% before World War I, it goes down because of World War I, and then goes up. And then after World War II and the Great Depression, it starts going down. So everyone thought that's the United States on the downward slope. And all the European countries are doing the same thing. That's why everyone thought this was a universal rule, because there's just so much evidence of it, at least of one half of it. But of course, as we've seen in the other graphs, after the 1970s, it's gone up. And its inequality has gone up in other countries too, not all countries, but in other countries. Piketty, who wrote the famous book on inequality, is arguing that really the decline in wealth inequality after the Great Depression is just an anomaly. You know, lots of wealth was destroyed by the Great Depression, and so that's why it went down. And then, you know, there's a question: wealth inequality is too high. How do you bring it down? Well, the only time that we've known that it's been effectively done is by crashing the economy and not bailing out the rich. So we could have done that in 2008, 2009, but you know, we didn't bail out everyone. We only bailed out the rich. But if we just let everyone lose their money, and then we would have much less wealth inequality coming out of it. There are lots of reasons. I'm not going to go into this of why inequality has been increasing. Globalization is given a lot of the does a lot of the heavy lifting in these arguments. The report by Stiglitz points out the financialization, and then the policies that have been designed only to help. The trickle-down economics, tax cuts for the rich, certainly have played a role in that. But what's becoming, again, a rather consistent argument, even amongst mainstream economists, is that inequality has a lot of costs. Now, I'm not going to go over the list here, but the graph, there's a book called The Spirit Level, where these two, I think they're epidemiologists, look at all these health and social problems in different countries. They create this index of these 11 factors, and then they just simple scatter diagram of inequality and how your country does. And this is a very tight fit of how the relationship between inequality and these various health factors. In my poverty and income inequality class, my students have to pick one of these, and then we do all sorts of analysis. How much is inequality? How much is poverty? And various other things. We see way up here on the top, the United States. And if you ever ask, what is American exceptionalism? That should be your answer. But the other thing that has been noticed is that economic growth has not been improving lives. There are just 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, lots of graphs that you could use to show this. The graph here is, I created for a study I did in Ireland, but there's a social progress index that Michael Porter, the management professor, has put together. It's massive amount of data. And here we just lined up countries' social progress index with their per capita income, or the GDP per capita, and you see that for countries, low-income countries, under 30,000 per capita, then economic growth is very much connected with improving in their social progress index. But for countries after that, the advanced capitalist countries, we see the trend line is flat, the R-square, 0.0087, the statistical relationship here is pretty meaningless. And there's just so much research that shows that even though all these countries have grown significantly over the past 30 years, it's hard to find evidence that the people are happier now than their grandparents were. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that they're less happy. On the right, we have a table that has the UN produces a happiness report, and then they break down what promotes happiness. And it's social support. Aristotle's right. If you have friends, you have connections, you're going to be happy. Income is still important. 26% comes to whether you can materially support yourself. I've been relatively poor and I've been relatively affluent, and I do not look forward to becoming poor again. So, you know, it does have an effect. Being healthy, being able to make your own choices, being able to be generous, all of these things contribute to happiness. Yet the plan for governments is always, if we can get GDP to grow, everything else will take care of itself. Okay, now Catholic social thought is not an alternative economic theory. What it is it's a different value premise from which to look at social and economic life. I love the summation of used by was it Kammerer, who I've never met. I know his book, but I don't know him. The Catholic social thought tradition has been described as being social wisdom based on biblical insights, the tradition of the early writers of the church, scholastic philosophy, theological reflection, and the contemporary experience of the people of God struggling to live our faith in justice. The other definition is Catholic social thought is what the Pope since Leo XIII, but they've been writing on social issues. So there's an encyclical tradition. But it does go back to the Old Testament, the New Testament, St. John Chrysostom and all the great church fathers, Thomas Aquinas. So it's a long tradition to work with. And this is, I have a little shameless plug here for the book Mike Norton, Sister Helen, and Steve Cordery and I put out, Rediscovering Abundance. But this is both the Old, the New Testament, the whole tradition. Wealth is a gift from God. Wealth can distract us from our true purpose. We have a moral obligation both in how we create wealth and how we use wealth. God's gifts need to be shared. In Catholic social thought, we call this the universal destination of material goods. And all property has, as John Paul II said, a social mortgage. All property is social. In the Catholic Church's defense of private property, which is a very strong defense of private property, they note from Aquinas going forward that all property has a social nature. You only have property because society lets you have property. You only have property because you had the social context that allowed you to acquire property. And you can only keep property because the police prevent everyone else from stealing it. You have a social responsibility to use it in a way that benefits others. And Aquinas is clear, that starts with being able to take care of yourself, your family, the people you're most responsible with. This is not an argument that you should be giving all your money away. But if you have extra money, then you have to use it in a way that benefits the community. And that could be by creating jobs. That's perfectly consistent with this tradition. It can't be, I'll have $1 billion and I like to look at it, so I'm gonna just put it in a room and sit there and look at it. Because that's $1 billion that's not circulating in the economy. In a capitalist economy, money has to circulate, has to be used. And when it's not used, then the whole economy shrinks because of that. We have a clear statement against inequality in God and His Spes. Whoops, sorry, timer. That inequality causes harm to the human family, leads contrary to justice. This is the Second Vatican, so this is the whole church speaking. And then, of course, Pope Francis is able to just sum everything up in a tweet. Inequality is the root of social evil. And Pope Francis has developed this way of looking at the economy of exclusion, where he points out the basic problem is almost always there is exclusion. There's some barriers to the poor, different groups being able to fully participate to their potential. In fact, a lot of those barriers are not being able to develop their potential. And so our first job is to get rid of those barriers by helping to building pathways for people to be included. But again, on the theme of the new idolatry of money, how the financial system rules rather than serves. And he actually also has an attack on trickle-down economics, which is very surprising because the popes rarely specifically go after a particular economic policy. They're very clear. John Paul is very, very clear at saying it's not our job to run people's economy. We do not have an economic model. What we have is a set of criteria that could be used to evaluate, are you doing what you should be doing? Particularly, how are the poor being treated in your economy? Are people allowed to participate? Or are they being excluded, et cetera? Okay, so the first step to developing a more inclusive economy is I think, to have a broader view of what is wealth. And again, this is stuff that I've been working on for a long time, but this is stuff that's become mainstream. That the idea that wealth is not just money, as the mercantilists thought, and it's not just productive assets, factories, et cetera, but to have a healthy, thriving society, we have to invest in a lot of things that are just like our physical capital, that we draw from them. They help us to do what we want to do, to achieve our goals, and we often just ignore them. We don't look at that as a responsibility. So we have to have manufactured capital and financial capital, but we also have to take care of the environment where we get the natural capital, particularly in terms of the ability of the ecology to absorb all the pollution that we're creating. But the real wealth of a country is in human capital, investing in its people. And in social capital, those institutions that help to support human flourishing. And so the switch in development language moved from economic growth to authentic human development, which is a phrase that Paul VI used. And we see this started with the Human Development Index, but now this is all over the place in the capabilities approach of SEN and in the Sustainable Development Goals. This is the philosophy that underlies it. And of course, the people of the UN don't make the connection, but the theology underlying it is Catholic social thought. And we try not to point it out too much because that's just bragging and that's not very humble. Our greatest challenge is climate. To address it, we're going to have to invest a lot of our resources into building resilience in everything we're doing, in our buildings, in our energy sources, in our food supplies. This, the market's not going to do. So having a lot of income inequality and wealth inequality so that rich people will invest it in a profitable way is not a good strategy, because it's not individually profitable for any companies to do this. This is something that will benefit. It's like building roads. The example Adam Smith uses, roads and canals. No company is going to make money doing that, but all companies will do better if the state invests in that. And so we are going to have to redirect a lot of our wealth towards addressing climate change. But the market mechanism here is not going to be the primary way of doing that. You can use markets. Economists are very big on carbon taxes. I haven't made up my mind on that yet. But the real lifting is going to be in building the resilience, and that's not going to come through a market mechanism. That's going to have to come through collective, and not just state, but multi-state cooperation. Similarly, in terms of rebuilding social capital and human capital, these are not profitable avenues. This is why we have free education, because if we relied on markets, we'd only educate a small percentage of the children born in America, and then we would be a very poor country indeed. And just here's an example of what the World Bank is doing and looking at measuring the wealth of nations. And we see America, or North America, that's us, Canada and Mexico, where we are the richest because of our investment in human capital. And of course, that captures all the patents and technology that we've done. And they're now including not only natural capital, but dividing it between renewable and non-renewable. So if you look at the Middle East, their wealth is in non-renewable capital, which means that's not a long-term strategy to prosperity, because eventually that will be depleted, or the world will get to the point where we can't burn it, that we have to leave it in the ground. And basically, the developing economy earn money from oil and buy everything else we want. And they're going to have to switch to how we're going to make things that the rest of the world wants, so that they'll trade with us, so we can, buy food. The second step is getting beyond measuring the economy and all progress as if it's economic growth. This is known as the Beyond GDP movement. And it recognizes that GDP is, it's not the best measure of how the economy is doing. It is improving, but it misses many things. And B, that it's being more and more disconnected to how people's lives are. How are they flourishing? And so in the Stiglitz-Sen report, they recommend shifting emphasis from measuring economic production to measuring people's well-being. And to measure well-being, and measures of well-being should be put in the context of sustainability. And so we have here the list of the 8 dimensions that should be the building blocks of how we should be measuring progress. All of these are points that at the Holy See at the UN, we've been arguing for, at least since 2004, when I started working, 2004, 2005. But again, going back to the 60s, when Pope Paul VI wrote Populum and Progresso, that these are the dimensions of social life that connect to human flourishing, and that is the basis of the real wealth of nations, and not how much goods and services you can produce. So the goal is to lay out priorities that you can measure so that you can then hold governments accountable. How is your money being directed towards these factors, which the consensus is will do the most to improve well-being? The government of New Zealand, right before the pandemic, they had a new government, and they changed their budgeting process to be based on well-being. And so if you want to argue for any programs to the government, it has to be in the context, how does this promote the well-being of New Zealanders? And it changes the whole way you measure what's a good idea and what's a bad idea. It doesn't mean everyone becomes hippies and listens to the Grateful Dead, and then there's probably not going to be much economic activity after that. You still have to do a lot of things that you would do in a market setting, because a market setting can do those things more efficiently. But it puts all values in the discussion, which is important because social values are just as important, but just because no one's making money on it, they don't have I was going to say the currency, but they don't have the push and support than the self-interest of those who can make money at market activities. So that you need to have a way of balancing them so that they're both seen for how much they do contribute to well-being. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Clark, for a wonderful presentation. We're going to open it up to questions. So if anybody has a question, please raise your hand, and then we'll repeat the question.
Summing up a 1,000-page book into one inequality. Thank you. And many of us were left with a bit of concern that, and I guess I'll try to phrase this as a question, not are we doomed, but if we stick with traditional measures of wealth, are you convinced that there is a real push towards wealth inequality going forward, that we really are going to be facing this as a major issue, maybe on par with climate change going forward? And I realize the two are not completely separate, but where are you on the R greater than G?
Well, I actually think that there's much more possibility that you can address income inequality than wealth inequality. Because wealth inequality it gets to the real power behind governments. And, it's just, unless you allow their wealth to be destroyed by someone other than the government, like the Great Depression, it's just hard to imagine. I mean, even if Bernie Sanders had won, there's no way Congress and the Senate would have done, more than 5% of what he would have proposed. I mean, so we have at best, a center-right politics in the United States. And the mechanisms for the state to do it outside of what we used to do after World War I, just raise taxes. I mean, there's no reason why the top tax on the rich can't be where it used to be. The economy grew better when we taxed the rich more than it does now. The top marginal tax rate used to be 90%. It was lowered to 70% by Kennedy, and then it was lowered to 50% by Reagan, and then they did the whole tax reform and got it down to, I think it was like 26% but it was a flatter tax. Now it's up to, was it 37, like that. In terms of the argument that do high taxes discourage innovation, invention, and work? If they're high enough, yes. However, all the research shows that you have to get to a marginal tax rate of over 60, 65% before you've discouraged any work. And we're nowhere near that. So yeah, we could raise taxes on the rich and sort of try to do it slowly. But I think through policies that bring more equality, not only in terms of spending power, that's redistributing some income, but just through providing so much of what people need outside of a market context, you can sort of become Scandinavian and provide housing supports, child benefits, universal health care, universal education, and then you have the results that you want. If you look at how the market produces inequality in Sweden and Norway, it produces more inequality than the United States market does. But they have a lot of tax and transfers that bring down their inequality to much lower levels. We don't do that. You could do that and you'd still have an advanced capitalist economy producing at a high level. This wouldn't create any disincentives. The main barrier for us, which is the main advantage for them, is their populations are homogeneous. So in helping other people, your Norwegians helping other Norwegians in the United States, efforts to broaden the social welfare system in the United States have always quickly been turned in where you're going to help Black people. And so we can't do that. The United States was close to having a basic income. Nixon was going to go with a basic income. And then the Southern Democrats said no, because then Blacks will have an income separate from them and what they controlled. And one of the things Southern states did is for people who are on any sort of public assistance, they would stop it when it's time to plant, and they would stop it for when it's time to harvest. So they all had to come out and plant and harvest and do the work that, you know, their ancestors were kidnapped and brought over to do. They didn't want to give poor Blacks any economic independence. And even today, I was watching CNBC the other day, and the big fear with was it Andrew Yang is that if you gave people money, then who's going to work? And because there's no evidence that if you give basic income, people don't work. In fact, all the experiments show that people actually, unless they're women with children, they end up working more. But they change jobs and they get training and they get better jobs, or they start businesses. But you have less control over them, and this is what they fear.
So there's an argument with which I have some sympathy, if I'm not completely convinced by it, that concerns about inequality are often a red herring, and that what we really care about, or what we really ought to care about, is poverty, right? So the worry isn't that some people have more than others. The worry is that some people don't have enough, or we go on to specify enough. So I wonder what your thoughts on that perspective are, whether you think that we have some reason to care about inequality itself, apart from the ways in which it's correlated with poverty in a country like the United States. Is it the inequality that's causing the problems, or is it just the poverty?
Well, sometime in the 90s, this became sort of the new talking point. And it often wasn't just around inequality, it was around racism. Well, you know, racism isn't the problem. We need to help all the people who are poor. And this became a talking point, but what never became an acting point was doing anything to help the poor. So it just became, well, you know, we don't need to do this. What we should do is, and then they'd mention something that there's no way they would ever vote for. I don't think you can address poverty without lowering inequality. And that's Francis's argument too, but it's just the poverty is being created by all these barriers that are also causing inequality. You have to take down those barriers to allow people that if you, there's an excellent, sorry, flipping around over here. The Economic Policy Institute did an analysis, and I'd done some research and was going to publish an article, and I read theirs, and their research was so much better than mine that I just scrubbed mine. But I looked at the relationship between poverty and various macroeconomic factors. And it's the economist Rebecca Blank, I think is her name. So she had written on the macroeconomics of, I think it was inequality or poverty. And so I took her model and then I updated and put in what I thought was better data than she was using. And you could see up until 1980, when these macroeconomic factors increased, poverty went down, and so did inequality. But then after 1980, poverty, those variables would still increase, but poverty became very resistant. So you could grow the economy, and you'd have to grow it like 3-4 years before anything trickled down to the poor, because inequality had wiped out all the benefits, that the economic growth was only going to the top, and so nothing was going. Yeah, it had to be like year 3 or 4 of Clinton's prolonged economic growth before you started to see poverty rates starting to go down. And this is in general, by gender, by race. So the barriers, and the main barrier is just the top takes the lion's share, just goes straight to the top. And then, so the poor are fighting with the working poor, or fighting with the middle class for everything else. And unless you take where the gains are going down and shift them down, I don't think you can fix that. She either has a question or she's trying to start a wave.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clark. I'm teaching a class right now called Christian Changemakers, and some of my students are here. And it brings me great joy as a Catholic theologian to see some of the good news of the church's social ethics really resonate here. Lately, the bishops have been in the news about sexuality and morality more. And sometimes Catholic social teaching is called the best kept secret of the Catholic tradition. Last year, Archbishop Gomez of Los Angeles said again that abortion needs to be the preeminent priority for the Catholic Church in the United States, for example. Why isn't wealth inequality the preeminent priority? Why do we have different priorities given the data that you've explained for us? Why can't the economy become more important than sexuality when we talk about the church and politics?
During the 2016 campaign, my then bishop, who I will not name, wrote a letter which basically said, vote for Trump instead of Hillary. If I was on Twitter, I would have said, why is the gospel the best kept secret of the church? But it's a good thing I'm not on Twitter. But the year before COVID, I used to be an advisor to the U.S. Catholic bishops. They have an International Peace and Justice Committee. So I was on that for 3 years. I think I was the last thing that John Carr did as a cruel joke to the person that replaced him. But a couple of years after my term was over, I got a request to come down and could I explain why is there so much anger in America? And I didn't want to mess with technology, but sometimes I've used this in presentation, but YouTube, Google this, or YouTube, this, but inequality in monkeys. And there's these experiments that they've done with, I think, the Campuchian monkeys, where they have 2 monkeys who love, what are those, cucumbers. And you give them cucumbers all day and they're just as happy. They really love grapes, but you just give them, so they have 2 and you give them cucumbers and they're happy. You give one of them a grape and then you give the other guy a cucumber and he sees the grape and he throws the cucumber at him. And they do it again and he's shaking the things. So that just the perceived unfairness, I think, is a great deal of what is wrong with American politics, except it's not perceived unfairness, it's unfairness. I mean, a lot of people I think who voted for Trump voted because he gave them permission to be racist, but millions of them voted because they've been left out and they're mad. And here's someone who, even though it's the party that's been, and those policies that have left them behind, he's speaking to their anger. And so it's certainly there. And we had a healthy discussion that income inequality and just the way Francis explains it in terms of inclusion and exclusion, that's the lens that they need to be looking at it. But the difference between the bishops in the 80s and today is just night and day. There are a few exceptions. The most remarkable of all the bishops that I ever worked with is your cardinal. I mean, I'm a huge fan of his, but he's a minority. And they would not write Economic Justice for All now or any of the great the great letters that they wrote back then. But in at least the diplomatic side of the Vatican that I work with, these are the issues that they keep on talking up. And and I'm asked to write speeches for them to talk on these issues. And they're working with Joseph Stiglitz and other famous economists to try to get this out there. But I see the argument that the church hierarchy doesn't want to be getting into the details of economic policy. But they should do that for other policies that they shouldn't be getting into. I mean, we don't have a Catholic country. We should like it that we have a separation so that we remain Catholic. But what you need is Francis to live for 30 years and just replace everybody. And then maybe we will have an effective voice back in Washington.
Any other questions? Okay, you don't have, yeah.
Emily, I completely agree with you, by the way, not surprising, I'm sure. But I feel like we've had a whole generation of Catholics who've been raised to believe that abortion is the most important issue. And this last Sunday, anecdotally, we had someone from the diocese visit and talk to my parish up in Poway about the environment. There's one of three, I'm sure you know about this, councils on climate change in the country, and it's here in San Diego. And afterwards, I rushed up to meet the priest and talk to him about how excited I was. And I got into a debate with one of my fellow parishioners who was chastising him for raising this issue, and that climate is not an issue in San Diego, that what we should be focusing on is abortion, because the number of deaths of babies from abortion far exceeds any of the other issues that are out there. And the priest was very kind and basically said, well, we can handle multiple issues at a time. But I would also think, and I think your question is fantastic, and I'll be very brief, but I think one of the issues is the clergy have not been educated on the economy. And I think it feels like it's way over their heads, or just out of their league to start talking about the economy. So I would like to see seminaries incorporate more training on business and economics, frankly, and to do it in a way, as Charlie has suggested, a way that's responsible, in a way that's in concert with Catholic social thought. And I think we can do that. I just don't think we've risen to that challenge, or even had people like you asking, questions like that. So my hope is that going forward, we can kind of, move beyond a one issue church and start thinking about and debating about and discussing issues beyond that.
If for nothing else, if you can get seminarians to read the church fathers, I think it would take care of itself. But they don't want to rock the boat because the numbers are so low. And I taught at the Angelicum for a semester, which is the Dominican University in Rome. And every Monday morning I would have donuts, American style donuts, which now when you go to Italy, the pastries are amazing, but every once in a while you want to have a donut that you know will raise your cholesterol level. You're not sure with the Italian food, that might be healthy. So the American seminarians and I would sit, and these are all with law degrees, some worked in Wall Street, very educated, then they decide to join the church. They're clearly being sent to Rome to be trained because they're expected to become leaders. And I had a bunch of them. I taught a course on Catholic social thought and the economy. And half my class was seminarians and the other were other types of graduate students at it. And yeah, they were eating it up. And all I had to do was start the argument and then the class took over. It's not the same way with business students. But I think the people who do outstanding work on these issues are always in the minority. We look back at Monsignor Ryan and think, oh, there were probably a lot of people like him back then. Oh, probably.
Any other questions? One observation on your comment, Emily, I think that the concept of the Catholic social teaching as our best kept secret wasn't the case in the 30s and the 40s. And part of that is because it directly applied to people's lives. They were much better educated on church teaching on the economy. Now there seems to be a disconnect there. So
you had all the labor priests out there, they were with the people where they were working.
Okay, so I'm the last question. I was just curious about who the most popular voice is speaking on an inclusive economy, maybe besides Pope Francis. And the person I'm thinking of is Michael Barber, Reverend Michael Barber, on his Poor People's Campaign. And I'm just curious if you have other ideas about who else might be sharing this. This is Reverend Michael Barber, not a Catholic priest, right? But I think certainly in line with the values. But any other people you might encourage anybody else here to Google and look up on YouTube to hear their message.
I thought you were talking about the Bishop of Oakland, Michael Barber.
I'm not sure. I'm not very good at different religious traditions, but someone told me there's one that refers to people that they think are really good as anonymous, whatever they are. So we had him give a series of 4 lectures at St. John's, and I was lucky enough to go to 3 of them. So I would say he's an anonymous Catholic. And he's doing great organizational work. And that's, there is the case that is where the action is, and not, academics giving speeches to academics. Francis, does capture so much. It's, well, of course, there's Gutierrez, I think he's still alive. I think I would have heard. Gustav, he was at Notre Dame a couple of years ago, and he was doing well. He was actually teaching at the Angelicum when I was teaching there, and Sister Helen arranged for us to have a lunch together, where I was too afraid to speak because it was like talking to Yoda. It was like he was so amazing. But I know that a lot of people. My daughter's a theologian. I went to Boston College, and I am very optimistic of the young generation of theologians and that the work they're doing. I'm perfectly fine with saying my generation screwed up and letting the younger people take over and do a better job. So I think the leading voices should be closer to the people and not those at the top.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Clark, for a wonderful presentation. And we invite you all to the next event of the center on October 10th. We have Alejandro Nava speaking on street scripture, God and hip hop, 4 o'clock in the same building.